Namaskar and welcome to our discussion, Queerying Hinduism, an alternative discourse and alternative lifestyles, a project of the Center for Indic Studies. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the presence of Sankhya and thank them. And I'd also like to thank the National Council of Indian Culture for allowing us the use of this space free of charge. I know many people have been wondering what exactly is the Center for Indic Studies, and because it's a topic, that people aren't taking on, and then you're going to go, well, who's the organization that's really doing this, Center for Indic Studies? Nobody really knows about us. So basically, the Center for Indic Studies is what we refer to as a knowledge support organization, which basically means that we can't support you infrastructurally, we can't support you financially, but we might be able to help you think through something. So we work with and through existing Indian cultural and religious organizations with the hope of building a stronger network between these already established organizations. Our focus is to bring to the fore an awareness of the Indian contribution to world civilization, which goes beyond but does not exclude the realm of the religious and spiritual, and how through its contributions we can think through current situations as well as through our experiences build on and extend these systems of knowledge. In that light, we have decided to host this particular discussion because of the increased focus on LGBT issues in the last few years in Trinidad. The draft gender policy, the Maurice Tomlinson case against Trinidad and Belize at the Caribbean Court of Justice, the Prime Minister's remarks of needing a referendum to decriminalize homosexuality, and there being no consensus on that issue in Trinidad, the children's legislation, and the response of several religious leaders to Joel de Souza's offering of herself as candidate for San Fernando West. When it was said that Joel was not breaking any laws of the nation, but was breaking moral law, we had to ask, whose moral law exactly? Moral law in the Hindu context of Smriti, or authored text, is very fluid. One can mean moral law in the grand scheme of dharma, which I think has to be one of the most vague terms ever. As a child growing up in a Hindu household and very involved in Hindu activities, even I could not exactly grasp what dharma meant. There's Sanatan Dharma, which is the eternal dharma or the eternal path. You have to follow your dharma, perform your dharmic duty. There's the more militant dharma rakshati rakshataha, those who protect dharma. Dharma also protects. But the definition of dharma, Center of Indic Studies likes best, is the Sanskrit is Vedaha Smriti Sadacharaha Swasya Cha Priyamatmanaha Etat Chatur Vidam Prahus Sakshat Dharmasya Lakshanam, which means reveal truth, meaning the Veda, Smriti and Shruti. Shruti is what we call traditional accounts of human wisdom or law. So that's the revealed truth, which is the Veda, the Smriti, which is traditional accounts of human wisdom and law, the behavior of good people, and what resonates with oneself. These four are the eternal marks of Dharma. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce you to our panel. I think how we'll go is we'll start with sort of the widest possible view down to the kind of narrowest of your personal experience. So we're starting with Arvind, Dr. Arvind Singh is a lecturer in electrical engineering at the University of West Indies, St. Augustine. He studied Sanskrit for the past 10 years, with his initial training being 4 years at the University of British Columbia, where he also studied Indian philosophy, and a further year of private study with Professor Santosh Shukla of Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. He has been teaching Sanskrit for the past 6 years, and he was the founding chair of the NCIC's youth arm and is the founding director of the Center for Indic Studies. And Arvind will sort of take the broad kind of view of what comes out of the textual tradition. Krystal will speak right after, Krystal Ghisyawan has a double honors BA in anthropology and South Asian studies. She's currently reading or writing for a PhD in sociology at UE and recently returned from a fellowship at the University of Toronto. Her research focuses on same-sex loving women in Trinidad and their space-making practices within the state, families, religion, and also the discourse. But she also looks at gender and sexuality in Hinduism. And then last presenter, before we start the kind of open discussion and engagement, is Shalini Sriram, who is an innovative artist who has been creating vibrant and undulating portraits of women, I think a lot of women, and men for the past 14 years of her career. Her technical style is informed by continuous lines, intricate patterns, swirls, and dramatic contrasts of color within the picture plane depicting Indo-Caribbean culture. She's primarily self-taught, using acrylics, oils, nail lacquer, collage metal wire in her pieces. And I think a lot of us probably see Shalini, if you haven't seen her exhibitions, really on Mako and Caribbean Beat, which I collect all the Caribbean Beat magazines, and she has been illustrating for Caribbean Beat, for Mako Caribbean and Express Woman for quite a while. And her last collection is titled Intimate Moments, dealing exactly with the theme of same-sex, loving relationships between women.
My presentation is entitled LGBTH. I suppose everyone knows what LGBTH is, and LGBT is, and could guess the H is for Hinduism. Right. So I'll just take you through 2 shlokas, and then sort of look at how the problem develops in the Hindu mind and what I think should be the framework in which we think about it. The first shloka, a lot of you will be familiar with it. Sarve bhavantu sukhinaha, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu ma kaschit dukkha bhag bhavet. This is a very universal prayer. It is a universal hymn. May all be happy. May all be free from disabilities. May everyone see only auspicious things, and may no one suffer from sorrow. So there is hardly anybody, regardless of religion or if you are an atheist or whatever, that will disagree with this sentiment. And this is really one of the overriding sentiments of Hinduism, one of the guiding principles, and we say it often in the Shanti Path. The second one, now let me go back a little bit. You'll see the 2 things that they frame it in is sukha and dukkha. Sukhinaha means a happy person. Dukkha is a sorrowful person. So these are the 2 things that we are talking about. The second one I want you to look at is from Manu Smriti. Sarvam paravasham dukkham, sarvam atmavasham sukham. Etad vidyat samasena lakshanam sukha dukkhayoho. So what is happiness and what is sorrow? Anything under the control of your own power, that is happiness. And whatever is in the control of someone else, that is sorrow. That is the Manu's brief definition of what is happiness and what is sorrow. The implication of this, I think, in these issues is that by demonizing, shaming, and even legislating against the fundamental nature of people, we are placing their very being under the control of others, paravasha, which means we are actively creating a society with sorrow of the most deep-rooted kind. And if we want to actively move towards a society where sarve sukhinaha is true, all are happy, then we must continuously strive to create a society where people are really limited only by themselves. So this is, in case I run out of time, the thesis of what I want to say, the Hindu thought and how it applies to the issue. So this is the norm. You grow up with this narrative that you find a friend, you get married, have children, and everybody happy. Aji, aja, nani, nana, everybody happy, right? But then you see something different. And what happens? How do we conceptualize it? How do we think about it? Can they get married? Can they have kids? Is this natural? Is it right? What does my religion say? Because when we don't know what to think, that is what we do. We go to religion and say, well, what does my religion say about this, since we are so heavily invested in it? And this is the crux of the matter. This is what we're here to discuss. What does Hinduism say about it? Well, it's not really that simple. Hinduism is not a religion of commandments and prescriptions. We're not, well, except for ritual prescriptions, but we're not going to find a program or follow these rules and get into heaven or go to hell. You're not going to see that. The Hindu knowledge paradigm is very different. It is the Sruti-Smriti paradigm, and you've heard Anila speak about it. So we have to understand this Smriti framework. So Shruti is revealed. It is composed of Vedic hymns and Upanishadic knowledge. It tells us what cannot be known through observation. This is Shankara's definition of it. The Shruti is that which tells you what cannot be known by any other means. It is totally unconcerned with societal constructs. And it is eternal. If it were to change, it would be totally pointless. On the other hand, we have Smriti, which is designed by the lawgivers for particular times. It is influenced by the Shruti, but it is also influenced by cultural practices and worldly knowledge. And this is a very important point. What is the state of knowledge you have in the world today? What are the things you know about biology, about chemistry, about anything? Those things influence the Smritis as well. So you'll find going through these Smritis, there are many societal biases, there are many biases, there are many views depending on the state of knowledge in the world. The Smritis are all evolving. They would be totally meaningless if they were static. So we have an eternal part and a changeable part. If the changeable part remains static, then we are totally lost. And that is one of the key problems we have. We have people who are looking at Smriti literature and Smriti knowledge that was 2,000, 3,000 years ago and thinking it is applicable today. Smriti is not absolute knowledge. It is always working with whatever is the best you can find at the time. What is the state of knowledge? So if the state of knowledge grows and you fail to grow and you're stuck in the past, then really you're outside the tradition. You have discarded the tradition. So this gives us two sides of the story. We have the Shruti and spiritual traditions, which are totally unconcerned. And you'll see a lot of iconography, scriptural examples, and so on, containing many diverse ways of being. And you'll see on the Smritis, you'll see disapproval. Some of it is mild and is usually because of children, issues with children, which we'll get to. They are barred from some rituals, so anyone who doesn't fit into the normal mold. But it's not only them. People are barred from rituals, a whole host of other people, including doctors, architects, business people, students, teachers. Basically, anybody who doesn't know the Veda is barred from some rituals. And when people quote eunuchs, as it is called in the translation, in some of the translations of the text, being barred from these rituals, they don't really look at the context in which it is said. It is not a singling out. It is really an exclusion of almost everybody. And then there's this big problem. What about rituals like marriage? What mantras are we going to say? Because the mantras exist for man and woman. What are we going to do when we have all this continuous spectrum of people? So, to get into it, some of the images you'll see, Mohini, Ayappa. Mohini is actually Vishnu, an incarnation of Vishnu, a female incarnation of Vishnu who has a child with Shiva, and that child is Ayappa. We have Brihannala, who is Arjuna, who takes on the form of a eunuch in his 13th year of exile. We have Shikandi, who was actually Shikandhini in the Mahabharata, born as a woman, and got a sex change to become Shikandi. And we have Bahuchara, who is the deity of the Hijras. And if anybody doesn't know about Hijras, Anila will tell you about them after. We have in some of the spiritual traditions, we have the issue of gender being totally ignored. So what you do is not really as important as the awareness you have when doing it. And the root of desire, whether it is for chocolate or for liquor or for man or for woman or for anything, it doesn't make a difference. The desire itself is the same. And then we have theories of non-agency and so on. The world, all the actions, everything you do is simply the interaction of the gunas. The gunas are the modes of nature in the Hindu framework, and the interaction of them gives rise to everything. It is sort of equivalent to the space-time matter paradigm. It is not really equivalent, I'm just meaning it is equivalent in the same way, that everything is built on it. So here, abnormality is really statistical. Everything exists on a continuum, and if you look at the clusters of behavior, you call some normal, the others are not normal. There's no judgment about it. In the law texts, they generally see gender as natural but undesirable. And this is primarily due to the issue of children. If you can't have children, then you're barred from inheritance, and you're not propagating the line. And if you have any doubts as to whether this is really the issue here, we have the story of Bhishma, who basically gave up his inheritance through declaring himself celibate. So because he took an oath of celibacy, he was no longer eligible for inheritance because he had nobody to give it to. In the Manu Smriti, only about 13 verses makes mention of klebas or shandhas. And these are the two words they translate as eunuchs. Kleba is often used in the sense of unmanliness. It sometimes has nothing to do with gender at all. And in the Gita, Krishna tells Arjuna in the beginning, Klaibyam mas magamah partha, do not yield to unmanliness, having nothing to do with gender at all. So sometimes the words themselves, even though they are translated in one way, do not really carry that connotation. And as I said before, they're barred from Shraddha, along with many other people. And that is about the extent of the treatment in the law texts. What we should also note here, and people don't often look at, is that there are many more verses dealing with the sin of Brahmanas not knowing the Veda. And in one part, Manu actually says, a Brahmana who does not know the Veda and partakes of offerings will swallow that many offerings of molten iron in his next life. So that is, and while you have 13 verses devoted to gender, you have many, 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 many more verses devoted to Brahmanas not knowing the Veda. So if at all you want to look at ritual problems in Trinidad, that might be the biggest place to start. So the main problem that is cited with respect to the mantras is marriage. If you have male and female, what is going to happen when you have people of the same gender? Right? The mantras are eternal, they can't be changed. What are we going to do? Well, that is not actually true. Well, there are many types of mantras. Some cannot be changed. You cannot change mystical syllables, Om, Hreem, Kleem, but you don't need to change them because they don't have any implications, right? You won't change a mantra like the Gayatri mantra, which is talking about some ideal. But there are many other mantras which are simply instructions. So when you sit for puja and you start, the Pandit tells you, wash your hands, and he starts muttering these ancient Sanskrit mantras, these mystical mantras, hastau prakshalanam, hastau prakshalanam. He's actually just saying, wash your hands, wash your hands. And if you understand Sanskrit, you'll see that the whole puja is simply directions. So it is not by changing the gender or the number of a word. It doesn't really make a difference with these types of mantras. So saying that, we have these problems is not really right. In addition to this, there are many variations to ceremonies reflecting local and regional traditions, and a lot of changes have happened over time. We have moved from Pashu Yajna to Pishta Yajna to Pushpa Yajna, from animal sacrifice to the sacrifice of doe forms of animals. So they took doe and they actually made a goat instead of sacrificing the goat. And then we are left with Pushpa Yajna, which some people say is the origination of the word puja, right? And if you look at any Veda at the end, you'll see a lot of flowers on it. Right? We also use interchangeably mantras from a lot of different places. When everyone gets up and says, okay, at the beginning of the puja, we need to chant, we need to pray to Ganesha. So then you start, Ganana tva ganapati gwam havamahe kavim kavinam upamashravasthamam. When you start that is actually not a hymn to Ganesha at all. That is to Brihaspati. But we have taken it from one place and used it someplace else because there's the word Ganapati in it. So they say, oh, Ganapati, Ganesha. Ganapati is another word for Ganesha, so we could use that here, right? So it has been done all the time. Materials are also being replaced, and I'm sure a lot of people do now puja with foil. Yes? So you are making all these changes, yet some changes we are unwilling to make with really no good reason, right? So in summary, Hinduism is not stagnant. It is meant to continuously draw from the eternal truth in the context of the knowledge of the day and help us move towards a better society where Atma Vasham, self-control, the people having dominion over themselves, is enjoyed. Flexible enough to allow change. Just by the way, there's a word in Sanskrit, dara, which means wife, and it is a masculine word. Right? So Sanskrit has gender, so normally wife would be feminine. Right? So it is flexible enough to allow these changes. And that is the end of my presentation. I would just like to leave you with this parting thought. It is a verse, I think, from the Nighantu. When the rishis were ascending, the humans asked the gods. The rishis were the Sapta rishis, 7 sages that came down at the beginning of creation to guide mankind. When they were going back up, the men questioned the gods, who will be the rishi among us now? Who is going to be our guide? And the rishis thus gifted this Tarka rishi. Tarka means reasoning, the power of reasoning to man, drawn out by inference from reflection on the meaning of the mantras. Thus, whatever a learned man infers through intelligent reasoning is sageness. Thank you.
A lot of his references came from Manu Smriti, which I think everybody has been holding for a while as the definitive law text concerning Hinduism, which I think is a bigger discussion we can have about when that text was privileged and by who. But I think the thing with the Manu Smriti is if you read it, you notice that it was written by Brahmin men for Brahmin men, and that the laws in the text don't really extend to the non-Brahmin community. So I think that is something that has to sort of be considered when you're using Manu Smriti. But of course, in the colonial era, the informants of the British were Brahmin men, and it was the text that was sort of used by the English to come up with a sort of treatment of how you're going to legally treat things that are people who are Hindu, and what is the legal framework then that Hindus used to work with. When this text was really written by Brahmin men for Brahmin men. But before Krystal and Shalini start, I also wanted to say that a lot of the readings, when you get a lot of examples of sort of LGBT situations, I wouldn't say that it's a definitive group in the kind of, mythical framework of Hinduism, there's just what I call queer situations taking place, right? That that a lot of it deals with men and queer men, and there's hardly anything of women, and I think it's because there's hardly any text written by women that speak anything of women or female experiences. So I think it's good that the research that Krystal is doing, highlights women, and of course the work that Shalini is doing also highlights Indian women, because those are voices that I think we need to bring out more, and there needs to be space for these opinions now. Within the framework of Hinduism, because for the vast history of written, recorded Hinduism, not oral tradition, textual tradition, the voices of Indian women are completely absent in their experiences. So I just wanted, that this inclusion is necessary in that conversation. Yeah.
Thank you, Anila. That kind of segs great into what I'm doing. And this research that I've been doing for the past few years with same-sex loving women in Trinidad, I've interviewed a total of 40 women, and I've done participant observation in different spaces, but only 8 of these women are Hindu. So my contribution today will be to talk about these women's experiences within the religion, particularly how they have found spaces of acceptance in it. And often this has been within the context of spiritual individualism, which is why I titled my presentation as that, as opposed to institutionalized religious practice. This means that the women look at the religion itself, its text, its content, what they see in the temples and what they believe, what they hear of stories. They make their own interpretations and then determine how they wish to practice the religion. Many pundits and spiritual leaders assert that this is in fact the way that Hinduism is meant to be practiced. And I'm referring to there being multiple avatars or forms of God that give limitless options. So a practitioner could pick the form that appeals to them most and worship that one in whatever way they choose, or in the ways that are prescribed. As Arvind said, there are kind of prescribed ways of doing ritual, so they can choose how they want to do that. And we know that is referred to as the Isht Dev, or the preferred deity. We could actually begin this conversation by critiquing Hindu and what that term means, and its construction and imposition to the practices of India, because it doesn't really apply to everybody. It originally was used to refer to the Indus Valley, which is now Pakistan, and used to refer to all of the religions of the region, not just to what we know today, what we refer to today as Hindu. And even in Trinidad, there are so many sects, and not everybody consider themselves to be Hindu, given that popular conception of what Hindu means. Because when we talk about Hindu, there are usually 2 different kind of positions that people tend to take. So it's either an ideal Hindu, Indian, vegetarian, conservative, heterosexual, righteous, ritualistic, and pure. But in the Trinidadian context, it could also include that you like doubles and curry, you're possibly an alcoholic and a wife beater, especially if you're working class. And these ethnic stereotypes then become attached to the Indian body, where the Indian is thought to equate to either that idealized Hindu or that pathologized or negative kind of embodiment of Indian culture. And they're expected to live up to these expectations regardless of who's doing the imposition or who's the expecting, right? So even within the Indian subgroup, we kind of expect Hindus to act a certain way, Muslims to act a certain way, because we believe these are the ideals. So what I'm talking about today is that social aspect of Hinduism, not the ritual and the prescribed part of it, but how Hinduism is lived in 2 ways. Firstly, in the community and in family, and the phobias that they carry, and as spiritual individualism, or what the religion symbolizes for the women who I've interviewed. So all of the 8 women that I did interview who were Hindu, chose to walk away from religious institutions and to worship in their own way because of the homophobic attitudes that they heard coming from the pulpits and expressed in everyday interactions. And I'm going to use some names. So I've named a couple of my respondents, and I'm just going to talk to you about like what they said and stuff. So all of these women whose names I'll be using, Aditi, Jaya, and Vani are women who I interviewed. Right? So Aditi identifies as lesbian, and she describes being called names like stink and nasty, and being ostracized from the religious community when it became known that she loved women. She describes the particularly hostile behavior of Indo-Trinidadian men who, in her experience, were particularly homophobic and offended by the presence of female sexuality. And she couldn't understand why they were so aggressive against it. Jean, another respondent, referred to certain areas in central Trinidad with somewhat homogeneous Indian populations as being particularly homophobic and showing particular animosity towards her being a visibly non-heterosexual Indian woman. And this was regardless of the religions that people actually practice. It's just like there was more Indian people living in that community. She was linking their homophobic behaviors to the cultural retention of patriarchal ideals and the emphasis placed in the culture on women's subservience to men. She says, this is a quote, "I don't like to go there because of how people, men and women, watch us." The us she's referring to is she and her girlfriend at the time. And the kind of comments that they will make, especially when they're drunk. Indian men take it personally that we're not interested in them. And my girlfriend was a nice Reds, so the interracial thing was another problem. She believes that men and women of Indo-Trinidadian descent are hostile towards lesbians because of their challenge to that status quo, that power relationship between men and women. And they were particularly hostile towards her for her apparent sexual and racial transgression. So although the same-sex relationship that she had was not one that could produce a Dogla, she still was visibly kind of challenging the purity of Indianness, and that wasn't really seen as acceptable. That's how she felt, right? The homophobia embodied in the Trinidadian communities and in families was also kind of expressed as being the most constraining factor with regards to coming out and leading open lives. Even if they lived openly but away from families, issues of family pride and hurt feelings came into play. So another respondent, Jaya, she says, "I think being out in Trinidad is about who you can hurt and how bad you can hurt them. It's just so messed up. But for anyone anywhere who wants to come out, they have to figure out what they're giving up. And then it's hard to control who will end up finding out and being hurt." For Aditi, being open about her sexual orientation meant having an estranged relationship with her family. She says that her private life was blown out of proportion. The siblings I have no longer talk to me, she said. "I have an estranged relationship with my father, who thinks I disgraced the family. The only person who knew and loved me for it was Ma," referring to her mother. Aditi had come out to her mother while she was a teenager, but her mom unfortunately died shortly after. And she felt as though her mother's presence and acceptance would have reduced the hostility that she felt from her family and her father and her siblings afterwards. But as this connection to her family was waning, she turned to religion to find herself again and to find self-acceptance. Similarly, Vani, who was 29 at the time of being interviewed, she was from a strict Hindu family, and she thought that she was doing the right thing by getting married to a man who she had met at university. And she wanted to pursue what she called a good life and straight values. But after this relationship fell apart, Hinduism became the tool for her to come to terms with her same-sex desire. So it's at this point I want to talk about some of the ideas, the myths in the religion that they recruited to find this space of belonging. This is Ardhanarishwar. Ardha is man, Nari, woman, Ishwar, God. Aditi described this form as the idea of masculine and feminine energy combined is who I am. Masculine and feminine are the same equal forces. To define masculine in any attributes according to what society expects is wrong, and the same thing with feminine. The only thing I can think about being masculine and feminine is genitalia. Other than that, the energies combined are the same, and that's me. Shakti and Shiva, energy and consciousness, and vice versa, and it's hard to separate the concept. So I'll come back to this idea of the genitalia and the body and separating the energy from the body. But I just want to locate this form. It appears in the Linga Puran. It's a form of Shiva. There are different stories, right? So one story is that Shiva revealed this to Brahma, who then split himself into male and female parts, and from that was able to produce, from each half of himself was able to produce different sexes. There are different stories. Some say that in the Lalita Mahatyam, it says the opposite, that this is actually a form of Devi that Shiva was allowed to merge with, and the feminine is the higher form. It's not that it's a form of Shiva, but it's a form of Durga. So there are just different ways in which it is approached. But the interpretations of this form basically, everybody kind of agrees that it's that combination of femininity and masculinity, that the two cannot be separated, and that each are indeed combined within a single being. The second image, is Mohini, that Arvind introduced already. She first appears in the Mahabharata at the Samudra Mathan, churning of the Milky Ocean or the primordial ocean. That's the scene that's happening there. And out of the ocean, various treasures come. One of it is Amrit, or a source of immortality. And Vishnu took the form of Mohini in order to guile that Amrit away from the demons who are in the right side of the image. I think I can't really see it from here. Because they took it. But Mohini also appears in different texts, the Ramayana, Vishnu Puran, Bhagavad Puran, Padma Puran, Brahmananda Puran. And another story is the one that Arvind already mentioned, right? That she merged with Shiva. Here, so this is an image of Shiva kind of courting Mohini. So there are also a number of different tellings of this particular story and that relationship between Shiva and Mohini. But it's a relationship between Shiva and Vishnu. And a lot of people say that it represents homosexuality and is symbolic of an acceptance of homosexuality. And critic Devadat Patnaik kind of disagrees with this. He says that to look at it that way would be to focus on the bodies, but what Hinduism is about is the soul. And it's about the genderless metaphysics and not the gendered myths. So the myths are gender limited, he says, but the reality of the religion is about genderlessness. So it's not about combined masculine and femininity, but rather neither exists. It's neutral. This space is really neutral, where both can be embodied and both can be performed. And that idea of gender was also referenced by Vani. So all of these myths that I'm telling you, like I said before, are ones that the woman pointed out themselves, right? So these are not ones that I picked, but ones that they picked, that they felt spoke to them and gave them a better understanding of themselves as same-sex desiring women. So Vani referred to the Bhagavad Gita and this kind of explanation of sex and gender. In chapter 2, for example, it describes the nature of the soul or Atman as genderless and sexless, and the body is the thing that is gendered. But the soul discards bodies like soiled garments and moves from body to body, while the soul itself does not change. It is immutable. So given that marriage is a unity of souls and not of bodies, we can see how this leaves space for the interpretations of same-sex love and marriage as what Arvind began. And this is important here, why she's thinking about marriage, because at this time, Vani was preparing to go abroad and get married to her partner. So she's trying to kind of rationalize that relationship and that marriage and see what her religion says about it. In other parts of the Gita, like chapter 15, for example, Krishna declares that it is a part of himself that manifests here in the individual soul or the Atman, while he himself is the indwelling oversoul or Param Atman, beyond the self. So it then means that God is the same as us, is the same as the individual soul. So if the individual soul is genderless and sexless, then it means God is also genderless and sexless, but from time to time occupies a body or manifestation that possesses those features. And Radha Krishna is another example of the mutability of the body, but the permanence of the soul, that the body can change, but the soul doesn't change. In this particular image, it's from the Leela of Lord Krishna, where he and Radha change their dress. And when they change their clothes, they're supposed to be identical to each other, that you can't tell them apart. And it represents that inseparability of male and female, of God with the world, of God with the individuals. And it demonstrates that the body is just a disguise, like clothing. It can change. Just as clothing changes, bodies change. And through the Gita and dialogues with Narad in the Bhagavad Purana and other texts, Krishna declares that any identification with the body is ultimately false and keeps us from true realization and will only lead to unhappiness. And there are a couple places where this is revealed to other people as well, that the body is nothing. So within the lessons of the religion, that's what it keeps, that idea keeps coming up. So I want to close with this idea that of the separation of body, mind, and spirit. As Patnaik points out, the gender-limited myths are symbolic of gender-free metaphysical. And the metaphysical is what is considered to be real, while all else, the world, the body, and everything material is considered to be Maya or illusion. But we cannot... just as Krishna says, don't identify with the body. We realistically can't do that because the body is how we experience the world. It is the medium through which we are experiencing the world. So you can't just say, oh, well, God says don't identify with the body, so I'm not going to. Even though that's the religious goal, it's not practical in social life. We do identify with the body, and it's how we are identified. It's how we are read and how we are subjected. So hence the discrimination and slander that are directed at bodies that do not fit the ideal, and whatever that ideal might be, if it's ability or gender or sex. So I'm Jackie Alexander, to bring in a very different perspective. She actually says the same thing, that the body is the encasement of the soul, but more importantly, it's a medium of the spirit and a repository of consciousness that derives from the source that is residing elsewhere. So if you know Jackie's work, she's very spiritual and very much about this kind of using the body and how we can use the body to understand the spirit and understand the world. And that's what these women are doing. They're using their bodies and using the religion to kind of understand themselves and their position within society. They're using their experiences to make their to make their bodily experiences intelligible, or how can we read what's happening to us socially through the religion or what the religion tells us. I hope this made sense. And to conclude, I just want to reiterate that Hinduism is not a religion of hate, but one of acceptance. So as the women are showing through their stories, they're seeing these spaces of love, and all of these stories about gender and transgression all have to do with love. So when Arjuna takes the form of Arjuni to be with Krishna, and when Narad takes a female form to be with Krishna, these are the stories like what Anila were alluding to before. When men transition, it's usually out of devotion, it's usually out of love. And when Sikandin, the story she mentioned as well, transforms to be, she's married to, the story is that the princess is married to another princess, and that princess throws a fit. Oh my God, I'm married to a woman. So she gets really depressed and she goes to the forest, and she gets blessed with masculinity, with a male body. And she comes back, and it's about love. It's not about hatred. But hatred is what kind of gets perpetrated in our social lives, and how we interpret the tradition is usually to extend difference and create differences, and the religion itself is not about that. And the women in my study, that's how they feel, and that's how I personally feel as well. Thank you. That's it.
Before Shalini starts, an important point for me in this whole discussion is that Hinduism is as much a textual tradition as it is not a textual tradition. And that is because for a large, population of Hindus, a large percentage, of the Hindu population, they don't pick up text or read text or anything like that. But so the tradition is sort of passed on through oral tradition, but also what's important for me, and what might also be important for Shalini, is through iconography, which I think is very powerful. So it's good that we have sort of what Krystal has brought forward, which is how tradition through lived experience, you transform understandings of things through your lived experience. And also, I think a large part of Hinduism is through art, and through bodily art, storytelling art, and also iconographic art. What is being said through these mediums. So a lot of times, even though the prescriptive texts sort of seem to be, their tone can be a little bit like condemnation, through iconography and through the sort of Puranic traditions, you get a varied kind of, very crazy kind of stories coming up. So I think for me, iconography has been a sort of huge part of sort of the influence of my own sort of pro-LGBT stance. So I think, Shalini, through your work and so on, that's sort of what you're doing, is creating an iconography of sort of Indo and Trinidadian, how we tell our stories through art and continue that long tradition.
Hi. When I first started painting or doing art per se, there was a lot I could not afford. One of the things that I would say Indian families have stock in them is that they want good lawyers and doctors and engineers and all these great professionals coming out of everything. Oh, glad I am being able to supply something that they would like, hopefully. So when I started to really do this, the support itself was not exactly there, because it was not along lawyers, doctors, or engineers. And my mom still says, you really argue points well, you should have been a lawyer. I say, well, it's not working for the family right now, but So when I first started, it was really out of necessity, of this need, this wanting to paint all the time. And I really did, I wanted to express myself. Everybody will get up in the morning and have their cup of tea or anything like that. I was the person who would mostly have my sketchbook in front of me and draw. And out of it, I kept drawing more women. And I know it was a bit of who I am and my desires, personal desires, but it was just a lot of women that I started to draw. And most of these drawings remain in these little coffee books. Most of these drawings remain there because I never thought that, should I show these? Should I express myself and show these paintings or anything? And, because of many things, because of not wanting to shame a family, because not wanting to come out and have fingers pointed at me or anything for religious or namesake or purposes like that, which I know a lot of people do hide behind. But there was something that struck me that was very important, that while growing up, and I'm sure a lot of us had these experiences, and he spoke about it, how isolated you could feel, how lonely when you don't fit into this square of what society, or this norm of what society should be. So last year I said, and I do risk something. there are people out there who may not want to even, you know, acquire my art because of this, or, you know, subscribe to it because of this. I said last year, if my art can reach, you know, one young individual that feels lonely or feels abandoned by family and society and everything else, if one of my pieces, or if doing this can reach them, then maybe that helps karma itself for me as well. So last year I came out with my Intimate Moments show, and the painting that is on there right now, that Radha Krishna, it had actually influenced me a little while back. So it's just one piece that had influenced me along there, because what happened was Krishna Radha had this relationship with someone else, was married to someone else, and there was this love, and I believe in this eternal love. So here's the connection of souls, and how do you prevent the connection of souls when they do reunite with each other? So when he changed his incarnation, he changed himself in order to be with her and protect her in that sense, so she would not have been ostracized, she would not have been hurt. So he protected her by changing himself into this feminine existence to be with her. So that was one of the things that influenced me way before, like I'll say about 4 years prior to me actually approaching the show. And there were, as I went along, there were always little pieces or just snippets of work, not a body of work. So to actually step outside and approach a body of work was actually risking myself. And I hope it in one way or the other encourages other people to step out, because there are so many people out there, so many of us out there. And if in one way or the other we are encouraged to just step out and stand up for somebody or our future, because I believe in Trinidad, and if we can step out and stand up for a little bit of our future, which is what we're trying to do here, I think it can make a vast difference of how we encompass people. We tell the future generations it's okay that we're here. Of course, some future generations like, I don't care, you know, and they will have those. But what about the ones who do care? And what about the ones who do care under this canopy of religion? What about them? How do we step out and stand up and be there for them and show them they're okay? It's okay to be there. So next, right? So this is examples of one of my pieces. And you would find that within this piece itself, there would be portions of the body that sometimes wouldn't exist. So in so being, it's just like stemming from what Krystal had said before. It's what becomes important. Is it the body that becomes important? Or is it the soul, actually, the connectivity that becomes important? And my work really stems on intimacy, not really sex, but sensuality and the connectivity. I like my work to actually create a safe space, you know, like, or display or project, creating a safe space or sanctuary for each other. So love becomes a sanctuary of souls and not just something that is of body alone. The embrace becomes of souls. It's like someone had said to me, in a complete embrace with someone on a bed or anything like that, don't you wish a limb was missing? Like could I just detach my arm for a moment to have that person completely closed in and hug them completely without feeling uncomfortable through the night and get up and go, oh my gosh, now I know, you know, my arm, you know. So that connectivity, I want that connectivity not to be of entirely the body, but of more of the soul. And here's another example of it, of this. I always have my embraces even closer, always have my people even closer. Because for me, that's what I want, the sanctuary of a relationship, to be whole. And even though like it is a merging of souls, and I'm trying to project that to my pieces, and obviously it's feminine love, and obviously it's feminine intimacy. And next one. this piece was very important to me. This was like sindoor, and this is the one of the last pieces I showed. And we both know that, you know, when the we all know that when we apply the sindoor in marriage ritual, it's that sacred symbol of in mourning of renewal of love in that respect, where the husband will apply this red dye to his wife's forehead. That's, you know, the connectivity there. Some people would have argued it and say, oh, this is misogynistic. But what would happen if it's not a man applying it to a woman, and it's therefore two women and having to renew that connectivity? I think it'll have more meaning in that sense. Who applies it to who? What if it's both? And they renew that connectivity with each other every morning. And that's why sindoor was very important, because the connectivity and the love exists there and stems there. And this piece was it was a very powerful and a place of hurt when I did this piece. This piece, Temple of Silence. It, you know, there's obviously the divine blue that comes out of religion, but for me there is this knife. It's physical dagger. So one of my three-dimensional pieces, that cutlass was actually one that was used in the cane fields. That piece is an actual piece, and that is a bit of my heritage as well, because I stem from a cane farmer. So I'm a cane farmer's daughter. So that cutlass is what we used on the fields. I just cut because we would have used it bent angle to cut cane. And, you know, anybody's familiar with wouldn't know that, but I cut it out and I put it to the center. Within the temple of ourselves, where would we believe that the soul resides, like here and here, your heart and your mind. And that's a core, I believe, my core of existence as well. So within that, there is hurt. And what do we do with hurt? Under the pretense of being a good Hindu or good religious person in any religion, we hide. And we always hide very well. Our hurts, we hide behind our smiles. Only people close to us get to know that. But otherwise, we hide it, and we hide it under these places where we have such a pristine look on our face. Yeah, it'll be like, well, for me, it was like hiding pain, but hiding it under a smile, or hiding it under a complacent face or peace. You would never, if I put something and hid the bottom part of that piece, you would never think it was a piece of pain. You would think it was a piece of peace, like somewhere on peace and solace, a good place, a divine place. But nobody would look within to see the pain, which is what we're doing to each other. We're not actually, by saying, we're pushing things on. We're saying, let somebody else handle it. Let gender studies handle it. You know, we are always pushing the buck on and letting someone else handle it. But for my love of Trinidad, and this is why I would have portrayed this piece as well, because it does not flow with all the intimacy and love. But for my love of Trinidad itself, I would like us to all, you know, like step out and actually let's show that dagger. Let's see that pain physically. Let's be there for each other physically. And the more we push the buck on and not be there for each other, who's going to deal with it? Do you, like, have you looked at children in your future and say, that little boy or that little girl, let them deal with it. Let them deal with it growing up. Let them be confused as teenagers. Let them be confused within even religion. So if one person, you know, if we could all just step out a little bit to help those children or help our future generation, Trinidadians per se, and say, okay, no, let the buck stop here for a little while. Imagine what we can change. So within the temple, if you look at the dagger, it becomes a beautiful part of self. It doesn't look menacing. It's very, like, there's this beautiful pattern that comes around it. So we start to camouflage our pain, and we start to camouflage our hurt, and perhaps maybe it wouldn't exist anymore, and we'll be all right. But it's still there. We just find ways of coping mechanisms. But I'm saying if we can just embrace it, and embrace the pain, embrace it, and actually change something for someone else, what a difference we can make.
Thank you so much, Shalini. Right before we started this evening, someone sent me a text saying that this will be televised and that it's a good initiative that we're taking, but to be very sort of aware of what we're saying because, you know, it will be televised and to sort of be measured in our responses and that kind of thing. And I was like, the whole point of hosting this is because, you know, we're so fed up of just tiptoeing around, you know, issues that I think should be talked about, and creating a space within the framework that, you know, that I feel that speaks to me, which is because I'm a Hindu, you know, through Hinduism, to make safe spaces for people to be themselves in that, you know, in that realm. So that's what we're trying to do today. And I'm fed up with sort of tiptoeing around things and being silent and that kind of thing. So I'm encouraging everybody else, sort of, you know, say what you have to say. That's what this session is about. So if anybody has any sort of question or comment, you can just raise your hand.
Yeah, let me start in terms of what I do in terms of the whole philosophy of the thing and how it relates to issues of gender. And it's interesting points that came out there. If you look at it, say, from a philosophical point of view, which isn't only Hinduism, although it's important in Hinduism. Yeah, the source from which we all come, Brahman, is beyond gender and is beyond these separations, you know. And Brahman is a word to really indicate something there's no word for. So don't even get tied up with the word, you know. But unfortunately, or fortunately, we work with language, and language creates things. So we, for instance, now we will speak about homosexuality. But in a way, that's a modern 20th century concept to try to come to terms with the reality of our sexuality that's very fluid, you know, and it's fluid in different cultures. So now we tack it on and say, okay, homosexuality. Now they use those letters L, B, I can never get them straight, you know. Yeah. So, but you have this source that's beyond it. But for instance, in Hindu philosophy, this, and it's a kind of almost an eternal theme in myth, how one becomes two. So you now get this difference, this differentiating. And they now talk about these two principles that, again, in terms of human language, are described in male as masculine and feminine terms, right? And in different aspects of Hinduism, they have different names. Purush and Prakriti, which comes from Sankhya, Leela, Shakti, Atman, you know, these, you know. Now the thing is, okay, you have these two principles, and we say that male and, when it comes embodied now, we say that male and female are these two principles. So it's not as easy as that, because we might want to say a man represents the male thing, which is Purush, but to be a man is to be both masculine and feminine, and otherwise. Even genetically, the genetic difference between men and women is almost negligible when it actually comes to mapping the DNA. You know, so sex is fluid, and when sex becomes, as it were, socially embodied in what we call gender, it gets even more fluid. You know, so I think it's, you know, to be aware of that. But also, what's very interesting, I think, about Krystal's point is that your informants, the people you're talking to, are still negotiating a traditional kind of philosophy and theology. But I think that there comes a time where even the philosophy or the theology is going to have to change in certain aspects, I think, and that's healthy, you know. So I wouldn't give up on the body. Yes, the soul is very important, but the soul is embodied. And I believe there's a certain point in the history of humanity where masculine concepts begin to dominate philosophically, and this is tied up to a domination of patriarchy. So Atman begins to dominate philosophically, and the female principle becomes Maya, but Maya is mother, right? Mata, Mata is mother, right? So you get that. And then in monotheism with this patriarchal God in other traditions. So don't give up on the body. Don't give up on the body, and that's finally, I'm talking too much. Finally, apart from, I think, just looking at it through texts, which is important, but look at how people have lived. When you go into the history of how Indians have lived, both in India and here, traditionally, sexuality and gender are very fluid affairs. And what was going on in the villages that people nowadays may not want to talk about and write about were very fluid affairs. And forms of sexual expression that might be more rare now, but years ago you would see at chutney shows and how men would be whining on each other and those kind of things. A very fluid affair. So look at the praxis of how people, I think, carry on things. Okay? Right.
Part of me is not sure what I want to say, perhaps because there's so much. But first of all, I think it's really important to recognize just how path-breaking this kind of conversation is in terms of the intervention it's trying to make into patriarchal definitions of racial and religious identities and the power that they have. So there are voices that are heard a lot, and these are not the voices and interpretations that are heard as much, certainly not in the daily press. The press don't go to these types of representations. And, I've thinking about Indian womanhood over the last 20 years, it's amazing how you see how the little things make. It's amazing how you see the difference that these things make. They seem small, but in 10 years, they erode walls that are set up in such an amazing and powerful way that it really is I think it's a real staking of very important ground and a recognition of what's been going on. A couple of things stood out to me I just wanted to ask about. One was the discussion of unmanliness. If you could just expand on that a little bit for me, so I can understand it a bit better. And then also I was interested in, in the Indo-Muslim community, what any women who have been challenging have turned to is the concept of ijtihad, which means interpretation, right? The right of interpretation. And in my interviews with Muslim women who were not allowed to vote, for example, in astral elections, or who said that they had rights that they were not being allowed, they turned to this idea of ijtihad. And so I was interested in how your idea of a right to interpretation, correct, well thought through reasoning, a right to reasoning becomes such a radical opening. And also in the context where there's a generation of young Indians that are well educated and fearless about the kinds of politics that they would want to live. And that combination of fearless politics and a capacity, a confidence about reasoning is, I think, extremely powerful. So it's just, it's interesting that those become points of openings for women, but also for men. And then finally, I was interested in, I guess what interested me is where you talked about texts. Increasingly we have the creation of women-centered texts, whether those texts are artistic, like your work, Shalini, which is amazing, and which is also radical in the kinds of iconography that wouldn't exist otherwise, and which we've all cherished for as many years as we've had access to it, certainly in Caribbean Beat, for example. But also the creation of women-centered text and scholarship in terms of the interviews and the voices of women that appear in Krystal's work. And so when we think about how little we can turn to texts for voices that document gender transgression and its intersections with love as well as religion, the fact that now we can turn to art and we can turn to scholarship and we can turn to religious reasoning and interpretation. 15 years ago, if you came to an NCIC function, you would see Professor Samaru, who I love, and a completely different politics. And so that combination of really wanting to think about gender transgressions as lived in daily life, to think about love, which is the universal transgressor, and ideal and justification, but also to think about how, there's an idea that Indian women, in particular, when they are not behaving in ideal ways, are losing their Indianness. And this is something that I've been arguing against quite systematically and will continue to do so. And I find it brilliant that one continues to claim Indianness, but in ways that you define for yourself. And so maybe you could just talk about those.
Well, I will only talk about the first part.
Yeah.
So in Manu Smriti, there are many different words. If you look through the translation that are translated as eunuch, so if you look back to the Sanskrit, you'll see that there are principally two Sanskrit words which are used. One is Shandha, which is sort of a hermaphrodite, and it is also one of the names of Shiva, for the reasons you would have seen in Krystal's depiction of the Ardhanarishwara. And the other one is Kleba. So Kleba is the one that really means unmanly. And what is meant by unmanliness is sort of having an effeminate man in the lay sense of the word. So it will occur in sections where Manu was saying, you should not beat the following people. Someone who's running away from you, somebody who doesn't have a weapon, somebody who's a kleber, and then it goes on. In contexts like those, kleber doesn't seem to have that gendered context. It has that sort of connotation. It also has a connotation of, to a lesser extent, of someone who is incapable of having children. So Manu, when he talks about inheritance, he says that a kleber is not eligible for inheritance. But then 2 or 3 verses later, he says, well, if somehow a kleber is able to have a child, then they are eligible for inheritance. So, and Manu actually gives about 20 different ways you could have a child. The primary way and the way that is considered best is what you usually think of. Man and woman get married and they have a child together. But then there's adoption, surrogacy, a whole host of other things. And he goes into a whole list of situations that children could come about and who is responsible for them. So if a girl has a child in her parents' home, who is responsible for it? If you get married to someone with a child, who does the child belong to? And he talks about all of these issues. And interestingly enough, one of the things they talk about is if you were somehow to acquire the child of a kleber, which means the kleber was married at some point in time. So these things are all taken into consideration, but not really discussed in any great way. Is also worth noting that they were not banned from studying the Vedas, but this is probably because the study of the Veda came at a very early age. So if you start 3-4 years old and your gender identity doesn't form till somewhere later down, then there would be people, all Brahmanas of course, who had these non-traditional gender identities that knew the Vedas. So all of those things were there. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay. I just wanted to respond a bit to what Britton was saying about not forgetting the body. Absolutely not, right? But I want to go back to text a bit. There's this story in the Padma Purana, I believe, I didn't write that part down, where there's this king, Puranjana, and he out of his love for his family, his wives and his children, he gets reincarnated as a woman. And when her husband dies, she mourns the husband and she's about to commit sati. So she's going to go onto the pyre and burn herself. And a sage, which is representative of God in general, comes to her and says, don't you remember you were that king before, and now you're in this body, you're this woman, but neither are you. You are not either of these people. So why are you going to commit such an act? But the interpretation of this story being located in this text and that time goes back to what Arvind was saying about all of these texts being contextual, that they are being written at a particular point in time, and there's an understanding of the society that gets placed into it. And so the interpretation is that this is revealed to the king in the body of a woman, because women are the ones who need to know that they should disassociate from the body, because by having this body, they have a harder life. So it's a kind of cyclical kind of argument, but it's saying that because women have this body, they experience life in more harsh ways. There's more discrimination. They have just the things that they have to deal with at this time, right? And I think Puranas is like 4th century. No, 14th-ish, right? The Puranas are medieval text, so it's considered like about 14th century. And yeah, but that it's relevant at that time to women to understand this kind of disassociation. So from this point, it's known that women see a hard life because of their bodies, and that discrimination is already like strong within the culture, that it's there, you know, these practices are there, and it still is. So it's absolutely important to look at lived experience, and how, you know, as Gabby pointed out as well, you know, look at these lived experiences, not just what the text is saying, but how religion is lived, because religion is a way of life. It's not about prescriptions. It's not something you do sometimes, and Hinduism is precisely that. It's not a religion you practice on Sunday morning. It's a way of life, something you do all of the time. So these lessons kind of get, you know, placed into all of our interactions, how we interact with people of different races or people of different class. Just when you say, oh, that person is a chamar, I don't want them come by my house, and things like that. There, you know, different ways that we embody discrimination, and we embody out of context ideas that are within the text. There is an online question.
So the question is a same-sex relationship okay or not? And
I think what the asker is looking for is justification. And I think we've covered that. We've talked about the different ways in which love has mobilized relationships of opposite sex people to and same sex people in different ways. If you want, you can research the relationship between Krishna and Arjuna, or Arjuni, and Narad and Krishna, Sikandin. What's the Arjuna's form? Brihanala. We kind of already spoke about it. It's fine. Go ahead.
She's right. Just before, when she started to quote, you know, like when we were going through all these centuries of quoting texts and everything, and anybody who that's not of the religion knows that, of course, when the husband died, the wife is supposed to throw herself in the fire. I think we gave up on that sort of tradition right now, as we all know. So yeah, we sort of give up on that, because I've not been reading on the papers or hearing lately that, you know, nothing like that, you know. So as you can see, the adaptation of texts is changing as we go along. So let's see what comes out of Krystal's new writing of her, you know, the next text to come, you know.
There's a lot of discrimination, and we have not addressed what about tradition supporting that. Why no older people here from the hierarchy of the popular religious organizations to say something?
so I think that was sort of what I was talking about. The difference in paradigm between a prescriptive religion and this Sruti-Smriti paradigm. And a lot of the reasons that we don't see people coming out in support is because they're really stuck in this paradigm of a prescriptive religion. So they don't even understand what is the Hindu framework of knowledge and how it should be applied to today's world, and how should it grow with the worldly knowledge as it is growing. They see it as still something stagnant, as something static that was written however long ago, and we must always go back to that, which is not the tradition. So one of my points is that we should go back to the tradition of thinking about it.
And also, I think what you're asking is why are we homophobic? Why is Hinduism, or how has that developed? So this is not the whole answer by all means, but as part of how Indian culture in the Caribbean developed, it is a very Ramayana-centric tradition. And Tulsikrit Ramayana as well as Valmiki Ramayana, those are the two versions that have been popular and center Ram and Sita. So that narrative is the one that has been mobilized the most in the region, and the one that is taken as ideal. So that heterosexual relationship with Ram as the ideal man, the ideal husband, ideal son, ideal king, etc., and Sita is his complement, that has become the dominant narrative of how gender should be lived and how sexuality should be lived, and how purity is tried in that text, right? Her purity is tried in the forest, and then after her return from the forest, different interpretations of that moment say, no, it's really a transferring of the real Sita into the fire, and the Maya is taking her place so that Sita does not get tarnished. So there's emphasis again on tarnishing and purity, and Sita's purity, the female purity, and that heterosexual relationship being one that is most pure, most acceptable, etc. So if you have a culture that privileges that idea as the ideal, then everything else that doesn't fit is condemned. And Britain was raising a great point that, you had the person who was funny in the village, and they were just funny, but nothing was wrong with them. They weren't treated negatively, they weren't harmed, they lived their life in a particular way, and right, well, yeah, well, he wasn't funny by himself. But so there was still a space, even within this context, there was still a space for people to live out non-normative lives. But there's shifting dialogues also change the way people behave. So some of the work that I'm doing is also on activism and language, and how language is shaping, and how human rights discourse is shaping people's behaviors and treatment of sexuality. And you find that because people now have more a different understanding of he not just funny, now he gay, now he homosexual, etc. This discourse that is now, and he's a criminal, criminal. So this discourse that is now shaping that interpretation of, you're not just seeing a funny person, but now they're funny with and bad in all of these ways, pathologized in all these ways. It then changes the way that person is treated, where that understanding wasn't there before. So the discussion, the discourse, it works in both ways, where it creates a space for this kind of discussion to happen, but at the same time, it gives a language to people who don't quite understand the language in the first place, then to use it in an aggressive or attacking manner. Hope that helps.
Now, I know you say we were being too polite. Let's just put it this way. I'm willing to risk my career for this. It's not me being polite. I'm just telling you, I'm willing to risk my livelihood, my career, for representing me here. And the people who should have been here and who have the biggest say in what's going on obviously aren't here. But at this moment, we're all here. You're here too. And you're saying it because it hurts you as well. And it hurts all of us. Once we create a lot of confusion in our society, we are the only ones who pay for it. But once we start clearing up and leaving things not for assumption otherwise, the bad Bulaman out there, the gangster, once we say, no, hey, no, then perhaps things start clearing up a little more.
Okay. So I appreciate the ways that women's voices have really come to the fore in this panel. But my question kind of stems from a conversation that, that Nyla and I were having prior to your presentations. Kind of where are the voices of men who love men? And are there maybe, masculinity, what does this say about masculinities and the way they're defined?
Well, masculinities have been studied, and the CGRS, Caribbean Review of Gender Studies, has an issue. It's out? It's out. On Indian masculinities and on masculinities in general. So you can probably find some men's voices in there. But I approach this because of the field that it's women's voices aren't there. So that's where we're coming from.
But I think also for me, it's in a lot of the readings that, like all these sort of Puranic stories, or like when you go through the sort of Dharma Shastric text, it's all men. Like everything, and I think what it has a lot to do with, which is sort of linking to your point, is that Hinduism is a very sort of progeny-centric religion, you know? Like it's the whole wedding ritual, which I think is sort of the problem with how do you adapt this ritual, where from the like Madikor night to, you know, the very end is all fertility rituals, you know, the whole thing. The red is a fertility symbol, the rice, the digging of the earth for the Madikor is so progeny sort of oriented that people don't know what to do with people who aren't willing to, you know, to reproduce sexually. And I think that's often why there's a lack of positive voices coming from the more senior people in the community. I'm not saying that's all, right? But the texts itself are so very much, because a sort of men not willing to have children is a real problem, because what are you going to do with property, and what are you going to do with wealth, and what are you going to do with all these things? So men are just the center of a lot of these stories, and you don't hear a lot of women loving women, because that's not challenging. You know, that doesn't challenge the status quo as much as sort of men loving men, I think, yeah. So what I wanted to also do, and what they are doing, is sort of creating that space, you know, for women to speak, which I think is just, it's just like women don't exist, you know, because I'm not seeing the text. Textually, oral tradition is a whole other thing, you know. Yeah, well, that's true for most religions and most sort of cultures, you know. Yeah.
Okay, the online question said that I said genderless except for genitalia. So they're kind of questioning that centering of the body and how I talk about the body. That was actually a quote. That was what Aditi said. She said that the only difference she can see between masculine and feminine was genitalia. So she was locating difference in the body. She wasn't talking about desire, but this question about where desire, the question is basically where does desire come from? If the soul is genderless, we must also acknowledge that the soul is desireless. That's what the comment is saying. I totally disagree with that. Why should the soul be desireless if it's genderless? That just simply doesn't make sense to me. I don't see how you would come to that equation. But from what I understand in Bhagavad Gita and so on, Krishna says that we have desires. The soul has desires. The body has needs. The body has hunger. You feel those things because it's the body. But the soul also has desires. And it is only through the unfulfillment of these desires that we feel dukh or suffering and sadness, is because we want things and we can't have it. So the ideal desire, the optimal desire, is freedom from samsara, or freedom from the cycle of birth and death. And in order to get that, we must then desire to know ourselves, or to know that we are the soul, because the other desires are connected to the body. But then in other stories, like in Bhagavad Purana and so on, when I'm coming back to this again, the story of Arjuna and Krishna and that relationship between Arjuna and Krishna. Arjuna so loved Krishna, he wanted to experience the love like what Radha and Krishna experiences. So the term sacred eroticism has been used to refer to Krishna because he's done everything under the sun. The man or God or however you want to think about that incarnation was a very sexual being. All of his stories are very erotic. All of his relationships are very erotic, and he's not the only one. Shiva and Parvati relationships also very much center sex and sexuality a lot. And there's another story about that if you want, if I remember, I'll come back to. But yeah, so Arjuna so wanted to be with Krishna that he did prayers and tapasya and bathed in a lake, and his body changed from that of a male to that of a female so that he could engage in love sport with Krishna. And that the desire then is not of the body. He's fulfilling that desire through the body and through a feminine body, a female body, because he wanted to experience what Radha and Krishna experiences. But the desire was not rooted in a body of a particular form. It was out of love or out of emotion. So as beings, whatever you want to conceptualize being as, is it mind, is it spirit, is it body? Out of being, we have desires as well, even though the body has needs on its own.
The word soul or Atma has different connotations in different streams of Hindu philosophy. So you're right that in some of them, the Atman is completely separate, it is independent, it is none of these things. In some other streams of philosophy, it is a repository of karmas and it is responsible. It is not all-pervading, it is individual and all, and that totally different view of it. So I think we can't really go into that. That's a whole different topic of discussion that we can take on another day.
The only way I saw it was body and soul. It's right out in front of me here. Just in front of me. There's the soul inside this body. This is just the empty body now. And that's how I saw it. And whatever fills that, I saw as the soul. Whatever filled this empty vessel, I saw as the soul, as your substance and your being. And the desire part, I think that part was just, it came about, at least to me, it sounded very sexual as opposed to anything else, any other connectivity. It sounded very sexual and very tactile in that sense.
To go back to the question of where the men's perspectives in terms of in this I don't know if it's a cultural universal. Maybe Gab could throw some light on it, but certainly in the Caribbean masculinity, because these things are historically grounded. Caribbean masculinity is a very damaged masculinity, and homosexuality represents the ultimate horror and terror in terms of that very damaged and fractured Caribbean sense of Caribbean self. Female sexuality among Caribbean men could be a source of polite humor and jokes and kind of thing, mocking kind of thing. But there's nothing funny about male homosexuality among Caribbean men. Nothing funny at all. And I suppose we have to be, you say you're being too polite, but I think about Anila and Arvind, and I think they're kind of out on a limb here, okay? Yeah. And one question, Arvind. Is the king of Arjun's impotency. Does that, anything about that and how it bears on this discussion, anything?
That was just to show a form where we had Arjuna, who was a very prominent person, willingly taking up this form for a year, living in the court of a king and so on. Well, it wasn't a curse.
Okay.
The Brihanala was the form he took to hide in the kingdom. So
it's not the same story that I'm thinking of.
Oh, probably.
I saw a story on the televised version where he goes to heaven to learn to use the weapons, and a Devi makes a pass at him, but she was with one of his ancestors, so she saw her as a mother.
Right.
And so because of that, she curses him with impotence.
That could be
I don't know
part of it. I can't remember the exact details, but it was in heaven as well that he learned all the arts and so on, and went back as Brahmanala. So it could be from that as well. That could be part of it. I really can't remember the exact details.
Jillian, because I'm thinking about the Indian masculinities thing, and I was reading the current, the journal, and I read Professor Reddock's interview, where she was saying that really it's okay. I'll get to this question right after that there isn't really not a lot of exploration of Indo-Caribbean masculinities in this kind of questioning way, because the thing that comes out of a lot of these stories, and even Arvind and I living in India, is that the masculinity there is framed is sort of a little bit more fluid, and there's a lot of blurry lines, and I don't know if that's fully explored of why there was a change, or if there was a change in the way Indian masculinities are constructed. And a couple of years ago, when the NCIC had hosted the Indo-Caribbean women's sort of discussion, we wanted to have after Indo-Caribbean sort of masculinities sort of panel as well, to sort of delve into these kinds of issues. And it might be something that we will look at, through the Center of Indic Studies in the future. So the question online is, from a non-Hindu perspective, I grew up with my best friend being Hindu, and he battled with his sexuality. His mother often threatened him concerning his effeminacy and the fact that he may turn into an animal in his next janam. Please comment on sexuality and how this relates to your next janam.
Well, if you don't attain moksha in this janam, you'll come back in the next janam. That's about it. Well, that's about it. It doesn't really come into play. At least not from what I have seen in the Smriti texts and so on. There's no real implication for sexuality and what is going to happen in the next janam. Except for they actually don't talk about what is going to happen in the next janam to any great extent. You find that more in Puranic literature. If you go to Garud Purana and so on, as I said, in Manu Smriti, the only time he mentions anything like that is when he said, a Brahmin who does not know the Veda will have to swallow as many balls of molten iron as offerings he has eaten. So that is the only time I have seen the next janam being spoken about in Smriti text.
I think because in the popular understanding, in sort of popular Hinduism, if people think that something is a sin, they say, well, pop on your head, and that pop on your head, which is a sin, is supposed to affect your next life or your next birth, right? So that sort of, I think, is what his mother would sort of be alluding to. It's, well, if you've committed a sin in this life, then it's like pop on your head, which is like the Hindu version of like you'll go to hell or something. It's not quite eternal damnation. It's halfway in between. Another reading I have of Vishnu as Mohini, though, is that, which again is the sort of fluidity of Indian masculinities, is Hindu masculinities really too, is that Shiva is often seen as definitively male, especially in his sort of ascetic practices. And there's this concept of Purusha and Prakriti, where Purusha is, that sort of which is unknown and immaterial, and Prakriti is sort of the material world. And in the concept of, putting icons to it, Shiva is often the Purusha, and the female form is often the Prakriti. But I think if you look at Harihara, which is Shiva and Vishnu, in that form, you see Vishnu as sort of the Prakriti, because Shiva totally does not engage in the material world. He's an ascetic. But Vishnu constantly intervenes through avatars, and devas are always running to him with some kind of problem. Can you help? And I think in that sort of respect, you see this sort of feminizing of Vishnu. So Vishnu as Mohini makes a lot of sense when you also put it against Shiva, who's the sort of, complete sort of masculine, and not just masculine, but sort of ascetic masculine, so.
I have a contrast to that, in fact. So in Valmiki Ramayana, there's a story about this king, Ila, who goes for a walk in the forest with his entourage and encounters Shiva and Parvati engaged in love sport. And Shiva takes on the form of a woman in order to appease Parvati's desires. So she desires to be with a woman, and Shiva takes that form. And because of the intensity of their love play, all of the creatures, including the king himself and his entourage, all kind of turn into women temporarily until Shiva is finished. And Parvati too, I would assume. And and then he returns to his male form. So within this story that is in the Ramayana, you see Shiva and Parvati who engage in love sport, and that happens all over the Linga Purana and the Shiv Purana. There are a lot of stories about their sex, basically. You see that fluidity, and so it can be read that within the religion there's a kind of homoeroticism and heteroeroticism that can occur simultaneously, and that it's not negative. So this could also go back to the question about if being in a same-sex relationship is wrong. According to Shiva, no. It's not wrong. Having sex with people of the same sex as you or gender as you is totally cool, as long as you both finish.
All right. So, just to go back to the question before about the Punarjanma, what is going to happen in the next birth, I think the important thing to realize is that is dependent on tendencies. So it is not specifically what you do, but it is, again, how you do it. So the sort of mindset you have. So the lay understanding is that if you have animalistic tendencies, then you will come back as an animal because you really don't need the body of a human. So it is not specifically what you do, but really the awareness and so on you do it with. So if you are, so animals, they say they're only about food, sleep, sex. That's it. So this ties back into what Shalini was talking about with the difference between sex and love and that sort of thing. So if you are looking at it simply as sex alone, then it doesn't matter if you are homosexual, heterosexual, whatever. If that is all that is on your mind, that is what would determine the next birth.
Yeah, so maybe we'll wrap up now and we can talk, amongst ourselves. And I want to thank the people who are streaming online for sending in questions as well. Kind of getting techie because I don't know if we've sort of ever done a sort of Hindu type thing in Trinidad with like this incorporation of technology, And I want to again thank the NCIC for allowing us the use of the space, and thank Sankhya for filming and streaming. And thanks everyone for being here. Thank you to the panelists.